It should be live. They are.
Will we message?
Yeah, that's true. That's all the
I guess you can press record?
I did.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. My name is Deborah Alexander. I'm the coordinator for the Center for Lifelong Learning at the University of Aruba. And I think it's with great pleasure, I'm very delighted that we do our first lecture ever in St. Nicholas. I think it's long overdue. And I do hope that we will come back many more times to have these interesting lectures, conversations, presentations, discussion in collaboration with We Culture. I would like to thank Celeste and Sonny Richardson for teaming up with me when I called them last minute last week, and open to looking for ways of collaborating with the university. And I would like to thank our alumni, Nicholas Warden, managers Culture Cafe, for going along in having this here. The interest for this lecture was quite great, so I'm sure people will flow in as the night goes on. But for me, it's the topic, and that's why I'm here. I'm happy that you guys are here on time, so you can have this very interesting lecture from Dr. Dwayne Plaza, I just had to think Plaza for him, who will be talking about local traditional Aruban comfort foods. This is a conversation we had last year when he was visiting about the same time, and I was so amazed to find out where the breadfruit that my parents and I have been eating for so long, to understand the journey as how it came to the Caribbean. And I'm hoping that he can delight you guys with this story, and I look forward to having many more years visiting us at the University of Aruba. So Dwayne, I won't speak too much and have you come up and share your story.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Deborah, and thank you all very much for coming tonight. It's always my pleasure to be able to stand and talk about my passion, which is migration. And what I want to do tonight is to marry migration with food. It's a topic that I've actually published on, and my topic that I published in was roti and doubles. So you may not know this, but I'm actually from Trinidad originally. I was born there. And so for me, living in the diaspora, which is Toronto, where I grew up, meant that I grew up in a household where I can still distinctly remember early on in the 1970s. We moved there in 1968, but by the 1970s, I can remember my mother having a grinder, and she would grind the split peas. Well, actually, I would grind the split peas for her. And that was really my first entree to thinking about, you know, as I got older, how important food was as a way for us, Caribbean people living away, to have a connection to a place that was almost like a nostalgic memory for us. So my mother and father were very much Trinidadians. And as a result of that, they really tried to put a lot of emphasis on doing things that were Caribbean. So going back to Trinidad at least once a year was quite common for us, especially around carnival time. And my wife here, Lauren, also has a family very, very similar to that, where going back and forth to Trinidad was the norm, because that's how my parents regenerated their batteries and came back to deal with the conditions that they dealt with the entire year in Toronto. But food really became one of those spaces, as I became in my area of research, which is migration, really became something that I could really understand how food migration and the way in which we share our culture with others. When my parents started to have a lot of Canadian friends, this is one of the ways they also entree their Canadian friends into their culture, by sharing food. And it was really important for them to get their friends to like roti. And eventually, of course, they would then entree them into pilau and other sorts of foods that really gave them a sort of a condiment. Make sure I'm on mute. Okay. Technologically, let's just do a stop share real quick. And yes, I'm on mute. Thanks. So as we go through this presentation then, I'm going to be very interactive with you all, meaning that I'm going to ask you at certain points to look certain things up, which I do with all my students all the time, only because it's great when you can actually use your own phones and see some of this information that's readily available to all of us, right? We have a computer in our hands, and it certainly allows us to do things that we've never done before. So let's begin then, and let's talk about traditional foods. I'm going to have you talk to each other. So you clearly, hopefully, are sitting next to somebody you don't already know, and if you are sitting to someone you know, please sit or converse with someone you don't know. To start off this presentation, then, I'd like you to talk to that other person, whoever they are, about a food memory you have of your mom's kitchen, and what was that food that she would make, or maybe your dad was the cook, that he would make that really give you that kind of, you know, I remember that food, and every time we had that food, there was a good memory about it. Okay, so let's take a minute or two and let's talk to each other about that. You all are experts in this topic, passion for it. So does anyone want to share anything about a food memory? And I'm not going to go to everybody, so just one or two people want to just talk about their food memory that they had, that they were talking to their other friend about. What was that food? Anybody now? You want to talk to me?
Well, I couldn't move around, but mine was low Creole.
Low Creole. Tell us a little bit about that.
It's basically a seasoned rice with chopped chicken. So with the bone, everything, and you mix it similar to a pilau, but yeah, with the bone and everything.
All right, that sounds great. Sir, you were going to say something?
Yes. Okay, three of us talk.
Yes.
And two of us have almost the same thing.
You did?
In the past, yes, almost the same thing.
What was it?
And the third one is similar, but a little different.
Okay.
My favorite a long time ago.
Yes.
I was born here.
Okay.
My mother's from Union Island, St. Vincent.
Oh, okay.
My father's from St. Martin.
Okay.
Mr. Walker Refinery.
Nice. Lagos. In case the folks who are visiting, Lagos is the refinery right across the road.
And my mother is from a fishing family. My mother's from a fishing family in Union Island.
Okay.
We used to catch fish all the way in Caribbean and come all the way to Aruba to sell fish.
Wow.
That's where she met my father. And at home, almost every day was fish. Especially yellowtail and those kind of fish. And funchi and okra.
Okay. All right. So cornmeal, okra.
And hot season.
Hot season. Okay. So we'll talk about the origin of okra, and we'll also talk about fungi, where it actually comes from.
Yes.
So we'll be able to talk. Any one more person? Anybody? Yes.
For me, it is like in Germany you would call it Kartoffelknödel. I really don't know the English term. It's like a dough out of potatoes, and you will form bowls and boil them. And we always had it on Sundays at my grandma's house. Yeah, it was the family tradition.
That was family tradition. Always on Sundays at the family house. And you melt with water. And so when you get that now, which you probably don't get as often, because you probably don't do as many family gatherings, how does that make you feel when you actually have it now?
It's like a flashback into childhood, and it feels warm and known.
I think we all had the same kind of feeling, and I won't just go to everybody's, but let's continue on with this presentation and hopefully make some sense out of all those memories put together with a sort of history of the Caribbean and of the world itself. My overview of this presentation is going to focus on 30,000 years ago. I'm going to start way back there. And I'm going to eventually come up and talk about European migration and cooking and foods. I'm also going to talk about European migration and settlement in the Caribbean, and talk about the slavery period, talk about the period of indentureship with you all, how non-European groups actually came to bring different types of foods to the milieu here. And then I want to focus on Aruba as a location where food got fused here in very unique ways. And then I want to talk about what are the current Aruban comfort foods, and I'm going to call on you again to talk, because I can only talk about these this much, the Aruban comfort foods. I'll tell you about them, but you can actually add more because you actually live it. And then finally, I'm going to talk about food fusion with the future. So in other words, when you look at this particular slide, I think this is the future right here. If you look at that very carefully, it's a slide that actually shows a new restaurant here called Bami's Kitchen, and they're going to be serving Jamaican food there, right? I say that because we also have groups that are coming from Colombia. We also have Haitians. We also have Dominican Republic people. And these are all people that are going to fuse food into Aruba in the next 50 to 100 years, right? So they're here now, but they're going to be contributing things that we don't even know what they're going to be contributing yet. So let's go. Let's make this make sense. So I'm going to start with a history lesson, in a sense. And history is always a great thing because it actually informs us about what happened in the past. And then it will actually help us understand how the native population actually contributes a lot of food to the Aruban diet, even today. So, the native population started across a land bridge that stretched from the Bering Straits and connected Asia and the North American continent together. And over a long period of time, hunters and gatherers were essentially crossing this bridge, didn't realize they were crossing, and it came all the way down to the south. And in between there, of course, they were dropping off people, and these formed different cultural groups. These cultural groups, of course, had different living arrangements, family structures. They came with different languages. Over time, they developed different languages. And over time, they also developed different food ways. So their food ways they developed clearly were ones that were unique to them over time. But because the animals and the plants and so forth they're eating, it also made sure they were also developing different ways of consuming and ways of being. So when we look here at Aruba then, let's look at a tribe like the Arawak, the Tiano, or the Caribs. And in some ways these communities had mainly based on fishing. It makes a lot of sense to be based on fishing because fishing really is that kind of place where you can find lots and lots of protein in the water, as you talked about. But at the same time, you can also find some variation on land because they can grow things. And so the early Arawaks were growing cassava, manioc, beans, squash, peppers, and of course they would eventually create a flour out of the cassava. And again, I want to challenge you to think about the part of our diet here in Aruba still has a lot of cassava involved there. Let me take off this jacket because I'm gonna get all sweaty here. So the Arawak then, and the Carib and the Tiano then, lived a sort of lifestyle where they would move around. So they would move in pursuit of the actual meat or fish to which they were hunting. And of course, they also, would also develop new ways of cooking. So adding things like lime to fish, something we all do today, and we probably don't even think about it. But when you add lime to fish, what do you think happens? When you're seasoning it. When you add lime to fish, what do you think happens? What's that?
It cooks it.
It practically cooks it, but it kills off all the bacteria, right? Which is something we often don't even think about. Like, you know, when you don't do that to fish, all of a sudden the fish will actually kill you. So again, developing those sorts of ways of living were some things that we actually all take for granted even today. Many of us wash our fish, wash our meat. They were doing that back then because they were trying to kill bacteria. So let's now jump over to Europe. And Europe is a really interesting place because Europe, during the period of the 14th century and the 13th century, really had no seasons. They had salt. What they were going to eventually find, of course, is a passage to go east, because in the east they had actually gotten an inclination, because they actually had a trade going on there anyway, an overland trade, where they were finding out certain spices. Black pepper was one of the very first ones, and other sorts of spices that actually came across the, we often refer to it as the Silk Road, and this was a road that actually traversed the continent of Europe. It would take years to walk across this road. And so you imagine how precious the commodities were once they arrived, and that included different products that we take for granted today. I'll talk about this in the next slide, but cinnamon, cloves, black pepper, all came from other places, and they eventually ended up in Europe. And so the goal was to get to places like China, Japan, the Indies, and essentially these are the places where they were going to find these riches, because ultimately they want to bring them back and add them to their diet. And so we often refer to this as the age of exploration. 14th century or so, you now have travelers trying to get access to these products, because these products now become sort of a globalization of the economy of the world itself. Because once you can control these products, you can actually amass a great amount of wealth. Okay, here's a question for you all. Who was, let me think about his name now, all of a sudden it's gone for me. Marco Polo. He was an Italian. He was from Venice, right? And his family decided to, well, his uncles and him decided to go to China. Well, why did they decide to go to China? They decided to go to China because they realized that they can bring things to Venice, all of a sudden they can be very wealthy people. And he's going after things like silk, porcelain, and eventually he found other sorts of wealthy things in, wealth-bearing things in China that included gunpowder. It included ways of cooking food that was very different. So he's going to bring back all those things and become a very wealthy person in Venice. And so as we think about these so-called explorers, we need to also realize they also explored because they were trying to get wealthy themselves. They weren't only exploring because they were doing it because of the good of the earth, but they were doing so to amass massive amounts of wealth for themselves. So when Europeans got into boats and sailed across this large, vast ocean, anybody have any idea how long it would take them in the early 15th century, 16th century to get on one of those boats and get from, let's say, I don't know, London or Spain to the New World? How long do you think?
3 months.
Less than 3 months. Or 2 months. 2 months. Could you imagine getting on a sailing ship and going for 2 months? And I don't know if you've ever sailed anywhere around here around Aruba, but once you get past the breakwaters, boats start doing this. They don't do the Carnival Cruise Line like this. They do this. And you do that for 2 months, and you start to lose hope in the person you are steering this boat to get you to the other side, right? You start saying, what the heck? All we see is the sea. And so for Europeans, though, I wanted to sort of understand why they were getting onto those boats in the first place. So one of the things they were getting onto those boats for is because Europe was actually overpopulated. Europe was also a place that lacked opportunities for them. There was no land. And so if you're part of the feudal system, it meant that you wanted to get to a place where you could actually get land. And so Europe was also a place that had a lot of refugees. These were groups that were often persecuted for their religious beliefs. And so these all became major reasons for Europeans to get on boats from Britain, Spain, Portuguese, Dutch, and the French. Notice those are all people that actually ended up here in Aruba, right? All eventually got here in some navigation way. But when they first got here, of course, they were met by the native population. So you think that was a good situation at first? Okay. At first it was actually okay. I mean, all the accounts were the native population was sort of enamored by these people. They actually thought, you know, who are these people? And they're kind of godlike. But as time went along, very short amount of time, actually if you look at the very first settlements in places like Jamestown or Pilgrims that settled in Plymouth, they actually saved the settlers. They showed them about food. They showed them how to eat certain types of foods that were actually in those places that the Europeans had never seen before. Because you need to remember now, this is a place they're coming to, huge continents or islands where Europeans had no clue about how to survive in those particular locations because they didn't have those situations. So what we have is something called the Columbia effect. Let me show you what the Columbia effect was. So let's take a look at this map because it's kind of interesting to see what took place. So in the Columbia Exchange, what you notice is that the New World here was going to provide some products which you are very much accustomed to and probably aware of that have now become part of the European diet. You mentioned potatoes. So a lot of people think that potatoes come from Ireland. We'll say that. But potatoes originate right here, right, in the New World. Sweet potatoes, squash, pumpkin, and turkeys. Peanuts, potatoes, tomatoes, corn, vanilla, beans, cacao, pineapples, tobacco, and peppers, all going in that direction. What came this way in terms of food types? Livestock, cattle, sheep, pigs, horses. Grains, peaches, pears, coffee, turnips, olives, onions, grapes, bananas. Very important product here, right? Sugarcane. Bees, and other things that came across, unbeknownst to a lot of folks, were diseases. So it's kind of interesting why the diseases actually affected this part of the world so dramatically. It has very much to do with that very first slide I showed you. And that is the slide that showed people coming across 30,000 years ago across the top of the world. Well, by the time they got here, as 30,000 years passed, they lost immunity to all of these things. They were sort of a society or a huge spread out group of people who had lost their immunity to anything because there was no diseases here on this side to begin with. And so over time, when Europeans did come on boats, unbeknownst to many Europeans, they were bringing with them pathogens. Remember, Europeans lived very close with the livestock, with their cows, their pigs, and their horses. Well, remember the flus, the bird flus, the cowpoxes, and the various avian ailments? Well, they brought those with them. And so that inflicted a lot of death on this part of the world. And so normally I have my students look up how many people actually died. Actually, if anybody have their phone or want to look it up, how many people died among the native population? So what was the native population pre-conquest versus post-conquest? Do you have any idea?
About 70%?
Or 95%. Yeah, so the numbers were dramatic. And again, it had to do, it wasn't because of only war, it was because of what we had happen to us here, which is COVID-like diseases sort of showed up. And the native population had no clue how to deal with that. They just thought their entire world was coming apart. Okay, so Europeans get here, they decide they're going to actually focus on a couple products, sugarcane, tobacco, and eventually coffee. As I've said, these products essentially have been brought here in a sense by this trade. And so what's going to happen now is, of course, you need a new system. If you're dealing with agriculture, you need a system whereby you have very cheap and inexpensive labor to actually make the system work. And at this point in the world history, the African bodies became the bodies that were going to be used to run the economic system, the global system of trade or growing of sugarcane and growing of tobacco, growing of cotton, eventually for export into Europe. And also, of course, exported to the United States. So let's look at a slave ship. And again, I want you to think about this as an economic system. And so they have, of course, had to figure out the cheapest way of transporting these bodies. So what do you think was the number of bodies they actually transported across from the Africa to the New World? Yeah, these are estimates, but they're very close estimates. You have an idea how many people would have been transported?
About 15 million.
About 15 million. And of the 15 million, about 12 million actually survived.
Yeah.
So think about 3 million people dying on the journey across. Remember we said the journey was 2 months long? Imagine being lashed into a ship for 2 months. And here's your diet. Typical slave diet included rice, farina, yams, horse beans. Occasionally bran was included. Some slaves were offered the African meal. One meal per day was served. And at nights they were often served the European meal, which included horse beans, boiled into a pulp, and given to them. That's quite not the Carnival Cruise Line diet, is it? Okay. All right, so let's keep going. So this system then became something called triangular trade. It's a total economic system. It's based on a capitalist ideology of accumulation of money in the whole system. So that you see it's actually a triangle, right? So Africa provides the most important element of it, which is the bodies who are going to work in fields, and then of course their products, which is either cotton, sugar, or tobacco, gets exported back to Europe, who then processes these items and then produces value added to it, and then uses the money that they're earning here and goes back to buy more slaves, and it's a triangular system. In all of this then, accumulation of wealth is taking place in Europe, while these other places, of course, are underdeveloped. And so when we take a look at this map here, we'll see then that many countries were involved in this particular trade and benefited from it. Okay, so we've got virtually every European country or major powerhouse was actually involved in the slave trade in some kind of way. So when people talk about reparations today, they're talking about the systems that actually built Europe came now to be in a situation where we need to think about how can we then recompensate those same people that built economies for the metropolitan countries. Right? So again, you can see here the Dutch, the British, the Spanish, the French were deeply involved in this particular trade. So, what was slavery like? And again, I'm going to now link this down to food. So slavery was, of course, a very brutal system. It essentially made people into animals in a sense, right? They were deemed as animals, and therefore you do whatever you wanted to do with them. Slaves who arrived here lost their culture, lost their language, lost their sense of family. It was a brutal institution overall. And of course, for slaves then, if you own a slave, you've got to take care of a slave, which also means that you have to figure out ways of feeding a slave. But you're doing so in the most economical way you can, with the least amount of loss in terms of the food loss. So, rations included for slaves. Cornmeal. Underline cornmeal here because you will see cornmeal, you mentioned fuji? Yes. Cornmeal, right? So it becomes part of the diet. Lard, some meat, very limited at first, and then eventually get rid of meat, because on islands like this you wanted to maximize the amount of land that was used for agricultural production, and therefore you didn't want to waste it by having a bunch of cows on it, and sheep and all the rest. So you had to figure out another food source, and I'll talk about the other food sources in about a minute or so. Peas, grains, flour. Slaves were also encouraged to maintain a garden, right, of greens, and so therefore this became the way in which slaves actually were becoming self-sustaining themselves, in a sense. But at the same time, they were also desperate for protein, because there was no protein around at this time, other than limited amounts of salted pig, right? Salted swine or salted beef, but oftentimes that was actually limited to only the master class. So what was Europe then desperate to find? European powerhouses were desperate to find a source of protein for these slaves. And the source of protein the saltfish. So where was saltfish coming from? So if you go back in the history of Europeans traveling, you'd realize that the Basques, which are the Spanish, the Portuguese, and the Vikings all discovered a source of codfish off the coast of Canada, places like Nova Scotia and Newfoundland. Newfoundland is actually a word that's a Viking word, where they actually coined that term. And so Newfoundland has vast amounts of these fish. There was more codfish in Newfoundland than had ever been seen across Europe, because they had actually outfished the banks in Europe. So by moving west, they found these new supplies, and so therefore the codfish could be brought in to the Caribbean as a form of protein, which is a very, very important part of how you're going to feed a bunch of slaves who are stuck on very small islands, and you don't have a lot of cows, pigs, chickens, etc. on those islands, so you can actually bring in these fish. And so Canada then, in a sense, becomes important because it has these vast supplies of codfish. It was so great, apparently, you could just stick literally a basket into the water and pull fish out. That's how much codfish there was in Canada. Because, again, no one was fishing it for thousands of years, and so therefore you have all this codfish sitting there. And so Canada then gets drawn into this triangular trade relationship, where it's providing salt fish for countries in the south. That included the Caribbean, it included Brazil, it included parts of West Africa. And in all those places, if you think about it, and you can go back and look at their diets, even till today, there's still saltfish in the diets of all those cultures. And the reason is, of course, is because that was the main source of protein for those people who were African. And the African people who were there at the time figured out variations on how to cook that particular item in different ways. And so, not surprising, all they would do, of course, is dry codfish and salt it. All right, so it's a very simple process, and once you've done that, you've got a lot of value added to the fish itself. What was also missing, though, in all of this was another form of a carbohydrate. So to find a new carbohydrate, we have the story of the breadfruit plant. So some people think breadfruit comes from Africa. No. Breadfruit comes from way across the other side of the world, in Malaysia and Tahiti and other Pacific islands. The breadfruit tree is, has anybody ever seen a breadfruit tree? Okay, they are prolific, right? Once you plant one, you will never starve again. That's what I call it. Right? This thing will just keep going. So if you've never seen one, you can Google it. You'll see it looks very much like this. It's a soft, pulpy middle. It's almost like a potato. And so for the slave masters, this was the ideal fruit because they could actually plant this thing and it would just proliferate, and then you could actually mix the breadfruit with saltfish. And so many of you in this room may have actually had that while growing up here, either in Aruba or in St. Vincent or in Grenada or in Trinidad. That's a real staple within our culture. Now the story of breadfruit is really fascinating because it actually involves notorious Captain Cook. Anybody remember who's Captain Cook?
No, it's Captain Bligh.
Oh, sorry, Captain
Bligh.
No, Captain Cook. Okay. Yeah. So the other guy, so Captain Cook and Bligh was actually the guy who started the insurrection against Captain Cook. He actually wanted to go back. So in other words, okay, so imagine this. The British sent out Captain Bligh and Captain Cook on this journey to find these plants to bring them back to the Caribbean. So what ends up happening, of course, is the journey is so far that eventually you have mutinies that take place. And the mutineers, led by Captain Bligh, said, Captain Cook, we're putting you on this boat. You can find your way back. If you find your way back, it's up to you. It's up to you if you are able to navigate back to the New World. Well, they never thought he'd ever survive, but Captain Cook actually used 6 men in a rowboat virtually and literally navigated himself through the Pacific all the way back to safety. He then got back to the authorities and he then launched a second expedition to capture these guys because they were all sitting on the Pacific Islands. I don't know if you ever know, the Pacific Islands are sort of like a paradise kind of islands. These guys had said, you know, we don't want to travel anymore. We found Tahiti, we found these great places, we want to stay here. Well, he went and got them all. And he actually had them tried, and they were hung as mutineers. So again, you look at the story, But in the requiem to the story, of course, is that Captain Cook eventually would bring 161 plants, seedlings, to the Caribbean. And those are the original ones that actually formed the eventual breadfruit trees that you see all across the Caribbean now. Right? So they started off in St. Vincent, and then they proliferated and they brought them around the island. Eventually, this became, excuse me, a real major food for the population. Okay. So let's imagine now we're moving forward in time. Slavery is about to end. But again, in an economic system where you're about to emancipate slaves in about 1834, they still wanted to maintain these plantation systems, but using a feudal kind of system. So they introduced a system called indentured workers. These indentured workers were going to come from places that had high populations of people, actually overpopulations of people. So places like China, India, the Japanese islands, places like Indonesia, Portugal, Syria, Lebanon. Again, if I'm thinking about all the places, think about the founders of Aruba. They all came from these places, eventually come here. But their ancestors came as indentured workers. They came here to find work in the plantations that were no longer being operated or using black labor. So I want you to imagine then that when they come to replace African people, they would also have with them certain food ways, certain food ideals that they would actually bring with them from these various countries. And so, of course, coming to these new places, they came with them in their sort of imaginary suitcases, right? They knew how to cook from where they came from, and they were going to bring that cooking here to this new world. And so let's take a look at some numbers really quickly here. I'm not going to go into any detail. But what you can see by these numbers is that countries like Cuba, Jamaica, Guyana, Guadeloupe, Suriname, and Aruba received some of those people too. And of course, these ethnic groups coming from India, China, and Portugal, and Syria, and Lebanon now started to make up part of the populations in these islands. And again, they were going to bring their foodways with them, food types that they brought. And so let me look at two groups in particular, sort of zoom in on them. Let's focus on Indians, and let's focus on Chinese. So my ancestors, part of my ancestors were actually from Africa, and the other part were from India, the two major groups in my genetic tree. And so if I think about the Indian part of my ancestry, they were actually indentured workers, and when indentured workers first came, they came on what you call a contract. And that contract stipulated you have to work for 5 years, but in that 5 years they would actually provide you with food and shelter. And so what were the kinds of foods they were going to provide these Indian people? They were going to provide them 10 ounces of rice, 3 12-ounce amounts of dal, ghee, salt, and whatever else they could supplement for their own money that they would be earning. They would actually then buy vegetables. So based on that limited amount of allotment, Indians then, of course, started to create their own comfort foods, which they would have had, and which would include things like, the notorious roti. Right? Roti would be big. If we look at another group, we would see again that the Chinese would have come, and they, of course, would have their own foodways also. And so if you think about some of the contributions they would have made to the overall diet, chow mein. Anybody ever have pao? Pao? Okay, so pao was really, really nice. I don't know if they make pao. Do they make pao here in Aruba? Not yet? They have business here now? Okay, so pao is right here. Comes in pork or chicken, and it ultimately becomes something that is an icon of development. Other contributions from other ethnic groups that involve Asian immigrant populations, Bami, Nasi Goreng, and Lumbia. So all these become contributions to the overall Aruban diet, in a sense, right? And these all become, over time, synthesized within the culture, such that we don't even realize they're actually coming from those places. So let's now talk about some of the legacies of the slavery diet, which was one, of course, which is cornmeal. So when we think about cornmeal, let's think about the ways in which cornmeal replicates itself on different islands with different names. So You talked about fungi, sir? We also have, of course, Johnny cakes. And Johnny cakes are emerging in places like Jamaica. Johnny cakes emerged in Trinidad. It's just the cornmeal rolled up together with a bit of water, and you fry it. Right? Why is that such an easy meal? Well, it's high in carbohydrates, and it's filling. Right? So people can actually fill themselves up on this. And if we look at the background for it, interestingly enough, cornmeal had already arrived in Africa, brought by the Portuguese, and so by the time the African population was being enslaved, they actually knew about cornmeal. That was a food they were familiar with, and so when they arrived in the New World, that's something they would actually once again eat. In parts of the Trinidad and so forth, we call it akra, right? Where you can mix cornmeal, and now you mix it with saltfish. You fry it, hot oil, a little bit of seasoning. Wonderful stuff, making people hungry now, right? And again, because the slaves were being encouraged to keep these very small plots of their own corn, it was very easy for them to create things like Johnny cakes, cornbread, and fungi, right? So these all became pretty typical across the entire Caribbean, all the way up even into the United States. Supi mondongo, Aruban style. Does that look good? So supi mondongo has in it, and I want to just point out to us, beef tripe, pig feet, and cow feet. So why do you think they actually have those parts of the cow or the pig in their diet?
Leftovers.
Okay, so they weren't only leftovers, they were left from the white European folks who didn't want to eat that stuff.
Yeah.
So pig ears, pig snout, pig tail, pig feet. These are all the things that and also
intestine, the tripe,
intestine, and so forth. Right? Those are the innards. They're high protein. Don't get me wrong. There's nothing wrong with them, but they're the parts of the meat that Europeans were not going to touch. So this is the reason why it got passed down to the slaves. And of course, the slaves and folks would use it and repurpose it. So in early records showing us that this type of food appears in the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, Colombia, and mondongo first appears in Latin America during the period of Spanish colonization. So again, Spanish colonization correlates directly with slavery. Cabrites, stobe. Again, traditional dish here in Aruba now. It consists of goat, or also consists of lamb and sometimes fish. Again, if you want to think about any stews at all, go back into the history books and you'll realize that stews actually emerged even in the times of the Romans. People were stewing meat since that time. Stewing meat just means you put a bunch of meat in a big pot, you add some water to it, and you just turn up the gas and then turn up the heat, and eventually it all sort of boils and loops together. And different cultures, of course, add different items to it. They might add some seasoning in some cultures, and the seasoning depends on what the culture has at the time. It could be black pepper, it could be just salt, but ultimately it's a goopy kind of situation. Over time, then, we also find archaeological evidence of the early Arawak and Caribbeans also doing this kind of stewing, and they would also use shells or turtle shells and other kinds of vessels to stew inside. Right? So all you need is a vessel and turn up the heat. Gambo. How do you pronounce it? Gambo. Okay. When we look at the ingredients of this particular soup, we realize it has some ingredients that are very, very common with regards to Africa. So the most common ingredient that the West Africans brought to the New World was okra. And you'll find okra sitting in a lot of dishes, and you don't even realize it's coming from West Africa, but it is. So okra is kind of the main aspect of this particular dish. It makes the dish itself, again, goopy. Right? If you think about it, kind of slimy, some people would say. We don't like that. I like that. You add to that, of course, pig foot, once again, maybe some protein coming from fish, and those become the ways in which you actually spice this thing up and actually get it to a point where you've got the protein, you've got the carbohydrate, and you've essentially got something that's very, very tasty. And you add to that, of course, lots of peppers, Again, the peppers are also coming from the native native folks that are here already. They like to have peppery food. And so you put that all together, now you have a really interesting dish. Kadushi. Okay, this is one I've read that lots of Arubans don't like. Right? Okay, so it's cactus, and it's a soup again. Okay, but when you go into it, you start to realize then that it also has, it's pumped up with, again, fish to make the protein, and you've got the cactus, which is the carbohydrate. So again, you kind of see a theme, right? Carbohydrates and proteins, these become the ways in which you create foods that are actually very tasty and also nutritious at the same time. Just a show of hands. Who likes Kadushi? Just a show of hands. Who likes Kadushi? Just a show of hands. Okay, so it was correction. When I was reading about it, correct. 2 people put their hands up. Out of a room of maybe, I don't know, 30 people. Okay, got it. So I get it. No shame on anybody else. Okay, now this dish is very interesting because it crosses over to Trinidad. They call this ayacas. Ayacas. Okay, we call it pastels. Okay, so pastels come from a Venezuelan background, right? And basically, it actually comes, if you really go to the origin of this thing, it actually comes from the Arawak native people who were doing this even before. What they're doing is they're taking cornmeal. They're putting, of course, with the cornmeal, you add olives. Here's where the Spanish is coming in. You have olives, you may have green peppers. Of course, you put some red peppers in there, capers, raisins. You then, and Lauren, my wife actually makes this every Christmas time for us. You put it all together. It takes labor intensive.
Very. I do it all by myself.
I watch.
The TV. I watch.
But what you get coming out of the back end of this, of course, is something that's very, very delectable, because you've now got something that is boiled in banana leaves, and the food ultimately takes on a little bit of flavor of the banana leaves, and it takes on the flavor of the meat and the cornmeal put together, and it's a very delicacy for breakfast food. Right?
Or evening as well.
Or even snack. Or even snack.
It's also interesting how it's written, because I remember when you sent an invitation, I was like, is it correct? But the language indeed has changed. Ayaka, you write it with A-Y-A-C-A, and here it's written complete, but it's online.
Okay, all right. I will vouch for any of that stuff, only because I'm stealing this stuff from the internet in a sense, right? I don't claim to be an expert in food. Migration is my stuff, that thing. It's my expertise. But I get what you're saying, yeah. Aha, pastichi.
Pastichi.
Okay, I said it wrong. You all don't know this yet, but Deborah's actually organized some of these pastichis for you for tonight. So.
too labor intense.
Deborah's not a magician.
But Shiva can make, so.
All right. So pastichi then, I had my very first one through Kevin last year, and we haven't looked back since then. We've had it a couple times since. Basically, it is an empanada. And again, if you look into the history of empanadas, you would need to go to places like Spain, Portugal, Iberia. This was stuff that being made in the 14th, 13th century. And if you go back to it even further, you realize that's actually come from the Middle East. Okay. So all that stuff is coming through us, and we don't necessarily realize the, which is fine, but ultimately it becomes a real important national dish here. And sometimes they're stuffed with cheese, sometimes meats, sometimes even seafoods. Another item that is the Dutch contribution here. Croquettes, and help me with this one, Deborah. Oliebollen, otherwise known as oily dough. So again, here we have an object in a sense where it's actually, again, fried, deep fried. Maybe deep fried tastes good, right? We all agree with that. And essentially it's an item that is coming from a Dutch culture. It's also coming from Europe. And so we sort of mix all this together, and what you start seeing here is something that's very comforting around Christmas time or New Year's, and you essentially savor these kind of things as a nice pastry. Right? So I'm going to just conclude for the night because I know that I only had an hour, and this is what Deborah wanted me to do. And so I'm going to just say the presentation that I've tried to prepare for you here really had a goal. And what I tried to do is highlight for you the combination of indigenous Caribbean ingredients with ingredients that were coming from other cultures that were coming to this part of the world through either forced migration or voluntary migration. But what I want you to understand is that all these cultures actually contributed to what we often refer to now as the Aruban comfort foods. I'm going to predict that within 50 to 100 years, we're going to have new comfort foods emerging in Aruba. Like everywhere else, foods are evolving, and the foods themselves will probably take on the flavors that I mentioned earlier on the talk of new groups. What are some of the new groups? Dominican Republic, Colombians, Haitians, other groups that are coming now, Trinidadians, maybe, Jamaicans, maybe. They will all have eventually in the next 50 to 100 years an influence on the Aruban cuisine. That's a positive thing, not a negative thing. And so again, we also have Europeans that are still here, and of course they'll also be taking that food to other places in the world too. And again, it's going to be a cycle, right? All those foods put together become fusion, and we're clearly going to have a better foodways in the future. So I want to say thank you for listening, and we can now have questions. We can also have dialogue, and we can also have drama. So you can pick whichever one you want. All right, so questions.
Great presentation. I'm still looking forward to see rice and peas.
Oh, okay.
Rice and beans.
Okay.
Moro, that's typical in Latin America is different. The Caribbean is different. And it's strongly on Sundays also in Caribbean.
Right. So rice actually has an origin to it, and again, it comes a couple places. Rice emerges in the Asian countries, but rice also emerges in Africa. And so when rice is brought to the New World, it then takes on different additives. So when I say additives, some cultures use black beans, some use red beans, some use pigeon peas. Again, but the idea is you sort of mix up the rice with something else to create an entirely new kind of flavor and make it much nicer. Who's talking about mix up rice? Were you talking about that?
Yes.
Yeah. What did you call it again?
Local.
Right. So again, rice is a carbohydrate, and it's a very inexpensive carbohydrate. So again, if you want to think about economies and the ways in which why people would have chosen to give those kind of rice to people who were very poor, it meant that you could actually feed them and keep them working for you because they actually had substance. Yes, other questions?
So the Caribbean is really warm. Is there any explanation to why so many of our comfort dishes are really warm as well and not like cold or more refreshing?
Okay, well, I have to ask other folks in the room who might have a better answer to that, but my intuition would suggest to us, to me anyway, that those comfort foods that are warm are ones that, again, require a little bit of heat to them, that when you get to Europe, and even some parts of the world where they don't even cook food, right, where they have limited amounts of wood, like Japan, for instance, one of the reasons why they have a lot of raw food is because they actually don't have a large supply of fuel to cook their food historically, and so therefore they're not used to food that you actually add a lot of sauces to. But in the Caribbean, I just think that we're used to warm food. I know that when I eat, my wife also knows this too, my food has to be piping hot.
Yeah.
Even if you know it just got cooked, I want it piping hot. So I like it. So is that a preference? It's a preference for me, but I'm not sure if there's any cultural. Can anybody else think of a cultural reason why that's taking place?
I was just thinking my husband likes his food hot.
Hot?
Yeah, hot
Okay.
as well. Yeah,
Okay.
so.
I think it has to do with again, the way that they got the food wasn't necessarily the freshest, so they had to cook it. Again, really well, they didn't kill it.
Okay.
To consume.
Okay.
They just learned out of it's better to eat it hot than eat it bad.
Okay. I follow what you're saying. So
Especially the tripe and all that waste food from other things.
Right.
They would have to make stew so it would be
consume.
edible. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's one of the reasons why curries emerge too, right? So curries emerge as a way of hiding bad food. So when food spoils, you curry it and you actually eat it. And you may not get sickness.
I've heard that there's even in the supermarket these days, just having seasoned meat, so you would buy fish seasoned. And I've heard many times it's, just to hide the smell of it not being that fresh. So that's why some people say do not buy meat that has already been pre-seasoned in the supermarket. That's okay, so it's still going on this day. I was curious as to, I saw someone last week, we fry a lot of our foods.
Yes, we do.
And I was thinking back at the beginning with stews, growing up in the West Indies, there was always water added to something. How did that oil, where did that
The frying comes directly from Africa. Africans love to fry food. That is part of African. Palm oil they used to use in Africa, and they fry everything. Again, it was just the way of their cooking style, which is nothing wrong with it, right? It's the same as fry.
Right, so you're talking from an historic standpoint, and you have these migration paths. Yes. Now with globalization, there's no real migration streams as they were in previous centuries, but do you see that, also influencing, for example, the food culture? Because you're talking about the next 50 to 100 years, right. But we already have Colombian and some influences here.
Yeah.
Is there still something to discover?
I think, again, I want to just challenge people to think about this. Has anyone ever watched the Food Network or the food channels or watched any of those travel channels? The real emphasis on those channels is about consuming different foods in other places. And I think that's really one of the things about globalization, is because it now exposes us to other foods, like Anthony Bourdain, if you remember the late Anthony Bourdain. He would tell you about things that you would never would have imagined had he not had that television show. Yeah. And so then it sparks our interest in sort of, being a little more adventurous than going to only certain type of foods. And so when we travel, I know my wife and I do this all the time, we actually try and go to some of the restaurants he features, or they feature, and only to try things that are different, because we would not have done that before. And so I think that's part of globalization, where now you're actually getting a chance to see these things. And so when you do travel and you hear about them, you're sort of gravitating towards them. Unlike Anthony Zimmerman. Remember Zimmerman's show?
Bizarre Foods.
Yeah, Bizarre Foods. I don't think many of us want to eat grubs and snakes and all that kind of stuff. But I do. Yes, sir.
I was wondering about the jollof rice.
Jollof rice.
Yeah, so is there any connection with the rice and peas or the low we have or whatever?
So jollof rice is a Nigerian dish, in case people didn't understand that. So jollof rice...
It's also in Ghana, right?
It's in Ghana too, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's like
so I think you're absolutely right. So jollof rice in Ghana and Nigeria becomes something that comes with the slaves. In other words, they bring it with them. So they already have that understanding of that recipe for jollof. And then it gets reimagined in the Caribbean, but they don't have all the same ingredients initially. And so they make pilau, or they make some other version of the same thing.
And the second question was, it always fascinated me that for example, so you're from Trinidad, Trinidad is descent, right? That they actually use these, they use a lot of sauces in their food, like as to add to their food, and like the tamarind sauce and mango sauce. And where does that come from?
That's Indian.
Okay.
That's India right there. Yeah. So all the chutneys, the chutneys are right on India, right? And again, coming from Trinidad, three people here, and many of you may have traveled to Trinidad. One of the things you'll see right away is you'll have a roti shop here, you'll have a Chinese restaurant here, you'll have a Lebanese restaurant right next to that, and all are doing well. Right? In other words, none of them are suffering. We say that there's not people wanting to go eat those kind of foods. Yes.
You presented from an economic point of view, of economic perspective.
Yes.
How does the types of food, the quality of the food relate to what we know today as or looking at it from a health perspective? Where people of color, are very much suffering from diabetes and heart disease and so on. How does the type of food then that was introduced, how does that relate to the
it absolutely
situation
does.
that we're living in?
It absolutely does. Yeah, they're very connected. So if you're eating a lot of high salt, then you're going to have hypertension and high blood pressure. And you're doing that in a good way. In other words, you think you're eating actually good, healthy food, and you are, but when you start getting older, you can't be eating the same food that you were eating when you were younger. And so some of us get that rude awakening around the age of 40, sometimes 50. And I say rude awakening, you go to the doctor and your blood pressure will be up through the roof. And they'll do your cholesterol test, and all of a sudden your cholesterol is like, we've all had those, right? Or some of us have had them. And that's when you start to think about your diet. And you start to realize that the plantain, the cassava, etc., the arrows, the blue food, all have lots of starch and all have lots of, they taste great, but they can actually not good for us in large numbers, in large quantities, right?
But sometimes we discussed, but I saw at a certain point, the recipe, I think the only was where milk was mentioned.
Yes.
And if we look at the whole history, milk was not really, not the cow milk was not something that was so present. It was really more European that came with the stock. I know that if you look somewhere in Wikipedia, you look at lactose intolerance, you would say that people just above the equator coming down are lactose intolerant. Doesn't mean that we go immediately to the bathroom, but our body does not process milk. But still we were brought up, all of us, with milk. And we're talking about yesterday that we would expect our bones to be the strongest because of all that milk. But most of the times we're often ones that have knee problems, ankle problems. So, sorry. Because of the weight again, actually not meant for us.
Well, I think, again, if you think about the human evolution of a genetic pattern of people, we clearly have evolved in places where sometimes there was no milk like that in large quantities. Whereas if you go north, milk was in their diet since the beginning of time, right? And so they've developed more. When I say they, I mean Northern Europeans they don't have lactose intolerance in the same way we do, because they had cheeses, they had meats. They had cheeses, then they had milk. That was part of their major form of protein. So their bodies got very accustomed to that. I'll give you another example of this. So one of the things people often say is Asian folks have a low tolerance for alcohol. You'll see the same thing happening to native people having a low tolerance for alcohol. Why is that? Well, they grew up in cultures where 30,000 years ago, they came across that bridge, in a sense, and when they came across the bridge, there was no alcohol in the culture. Whereas in Europe, alcohol was very much part of the culture because the water was so bad. And so people would actually feed their babies beer. Wow. Because they would boil, it's a very low rate of beer, right? But you knew that if you just drank the water in Europe, you'd end up dead. It was just known. And so you're better off drinking beer. So Europeans actually developed a higher tolerance for alcohol genetically over time. Contrast that though with native people who have a very low tolerance for that. They lack a genetic breaking down of the alcohol substance itself. And so by the time alcohol gets reintroduced into that culture by Europeans, it's devastating to them because their bodies are not used to processing. So they could literally have 2 drinks, and a European could have 10 drinks, and they would be drunker than the European person. And we see that even today in American communities. The alcohol consumption rates are very high for other types of reasons, but they also don't process alcohol the same way in their bodies as Europeans do. It's the same idea, isn't it? Right.
I have a Facebook question.
A Facebook,
yes.
Facebook question.
You've mentioned the Johnny cake had was cornmeal. So the question is it originally cornmeal or as opposed to flour that is used now?
As we know now.
Oh, for sure. It's originally cornmeal. Cornmeal came way before flour in the sense of how cheap cornmeal was. So corn was very cheap. Wheat is very expensive. And so I don't think the slaves ever got really wheat at all in their diet. Only after the fact. Yes? It is. Yes. So native people actually have something called fry bread, which is very, very similar in terms of the idea. Elephant ears, they call it all kinds of different things. But fry bake, yeah, we also have fry bake in Trinidad. But again, as you mentioned, eat that enough, and as you get to a certain age, and you're going to eat it still, and then all of a sudden, your body doesn't process it the same way. And we're still eating the same amount. Yes?
A small question. Aruba is struggling or trying to produce more food, right? Okay. Vegetables, etc., etc. Now, I just get the impression that you're a guy who is professional, who knows a lot about food. Are you also, based on Aruba, trying to set up methods, to be able to produce more food?
Well, I've heard about something called vertical farming that's taking place here in Aruba. And I think that's the next wave for figuring out how to produce more food. Yes. But Aruba also has, unfortunately, in a situation where it's probably cheaper to bring in food from the United States and the rest of the world than to produce the vertical farms that might need to exist here. Yeah. Only because you're literally in a corridor where the farms in the United States are huge, and they can outproduce, because they're subsidized too, right? Let's recognize that too. American farms are subsidized. And so they can dump that stuff on the market. They can dump corn on the market so cheaply that they can actually, this has actually happened in Mexico. Mexico actually lost its corn industry because of free trade, but also because the United States corn farmers could dump all their corn there. So I think that's the hardest part. I think it'd be great if we could actually do more backyard farming for the individual person. We don't even do that in Trinidad. I always find that a real shame. When I was growing up in my grandparents' house, my grandfather used to keep chickens. He used to keep all kinds of other animals. He used to grow things. That all went away. And so we have a generation of Trinidadians who are more likely to go to the grocery store or the market and buy it there than they are to grow it themselves. It's a real shame. Yes,
yeah, sorry for asking, but I think it's nice to share. I remember when we met last year, you told me the story about the Irish potato that came from South America, and people would not eat it because it was grown underground.
Yeah, sure. So when potatoes first arrived into Europe, unlike your family, they were not. They didn't eat. Nobody wanted to eat them because it was a vegetable in a sense grown underground. So underground for Europeans at that time meant that was the devil's food. They would only eat foods that were actually, fruit bearing and things that are above ground. It took the king, and it happened in France, first king that actually had to put that on his table and show the commoners that he was eating it. And that then became the incentive for a lot of other people to say, okay, we can actually eat this potatoes. So Ireland then becomes essentially a place that gets labeled as the potato growing capital of the world, right? I mean, yeah, I'm just saying, it gets labeled that. But it really wasn't. It was just the Irish diet eventually started going to that because it was a very cheap carbohydrate. And then they eventually suffered, right? The Great Irish Famine that takes place in the 1850s and 1860s, and essentially kills off millions of Irish people because the potatoes they got disease, and they wouldn't come, and people had to leave Ireland and come to the United States and go other parts of the world. Yeah.
You mentioned that the Europeans would not eat the pig foot or something.
Oh yes.
Like this. Like when did it start to separate? What was the reason?
Oh, I just think. Okay, so those parts of the animal, feet, snout, ears, tail. They just and again, I don't want to generalize and say every European, but again, the upper middle class of Europeans never ate that food. I would sort of imagine though that the lowest class of Europeans are probably eating that food because they were desperate for any kind of protein. But it's almost like chicken feet. That's another part of the chicken that only recently, through dim sum, has caught on for a lot of non-Chinese people. Now the Chinese have eaten chicken feet for millennia of time. But for other cultures, when they see the foot of a chicken, they go, well, that has to be thrown out. Because that foot is all over the ground, right? So I'm just saying, over time, other cultures, even European cultures even now, are now starting to embrace, especially around that sort of foodie culture, where things like cow foot and cow tail, even cow tail, which is oxtail, they often call it, right? Has now become a delicacy for some cultures in Europe. Yeah.
So you mentioned protein and tying it to meat several times.
Yes.
Where does the cow get its protein?
Oh, from the sun.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's a clear. I mean, if you can cut that. I'm not a vegetarian. Kevin is.
Be careful. I have a history.
But if you can get your food closer from the source itself, you're going to get much better off. We, as an advanced, so-called advanced people, we've said, no, we'd rather eat the cow than we'd actually rather eat the vegetables.
But in this case, would you, just think about it, the most powerful animal in the jungle, the gorilla, where does it get its protein?
I would imagine that the lots of fruits and lots of vegetables that the gorilla is actually eating.
So,
yeah. And because, again, if you want to come back to the closer you are
to your
the
food
source, which is actually the sun, you actually will have more energy. Yeah. So those folks who actually eat lots of meat, they end up actually killing themselves off earlier on than people who are vegetarians, without a doubt.
And when the people recognize how to eat actually, so what's the how did they know that they need proteins and they need
carbohydrates?
Yeah, was it like trial and error or?
Well, again, I think it goes back to just human beings eating omnivorously, right? I want you to think about human beings, early human beings were scavengers. I mean, they would scavenge anything to eat, right? I mean, if you go, there's a great show I like to watch every so often. You ever watch it called Naked and Afraid?
Yeah.
Okay. It's a show, I'm not saying it's realistic, but what I like to watch about that is because, not because people are naked, but it's because of the huge weight loss that takes place to those people. And why is the weight loss? Because all of a sudden protein's out of their diet, right? Because they're actually put out in the middle of somewhere, and they've got to survive for 21 days sometimes, right? And in those 21 days, they can lose 15, 20, 25 pounds because there's no more proteins around. Why are there no more proteins? There's no more proteins because they have to catch it. And if you have to catch protein, you're in a lot of trouble. Unless you find yourself near an ocean. Because, anybody here a hunter? Anybody ever hunt? Well, many years ago. I usually like to ask my students the same questions because I come from Oregon and lots of my students are hunters. And the question I ask them is, how often do you catch a deer? Never caught one. And they've been at it for years because it's really hard to kill an animal, only because animals are very elusive and they're not easy to catch. So much less if you're in a situation where you have to hunt your own protein, then you may not be eating a lot of protein. Right? We live, of course, now where they have these massive kill farms where they raise 1 million chickens in one place, and you get your chicken, and it's like from the grocery store, you have to go and hunt the chicken. It's just there for you. Same with cattle too. But I just think, how do we figure out the balance? Again, it always has been those who actually were the higher status people often got the most amount of protein. So in let's say a hunting and gathering group, right? The people who actually were the highest status in those groups got the larger amount of meat. And so over time, that became kind of a reward system. Those who actually were wealthier had more meat than those who were poor. So unfortunately, there's no drama. Looking for some drama. Would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, but it's not directly food. You mentioned a couple of times, for instance, the indentured people.
Indentured workers.
Workers. For instance, China. You said a lot came from China.
Yes, they did.
Right now, China has a population, I think, about 1 billion.
Yes, they do.
And you said that it was overpopulated at that time. That's what it came from.
Yes.
At that time, according to it was only about 50 million.
Well, I think China is once again reaching a point of overpopulation again. If you remember China's policy up to about 10 years ago, the one-child policy, it was designed to try to deal with that overpopulation. And now they've gone back to say, okay, you're going to have 2 children now. Right? So, still.
But at that time, it was only about 50 million, so it was not overpopulated.
Oh yeah, well, overpopulation is all, again, relative. And I say relative because if you actually had people spread out, then we're not overpopulated on this earth. But if you have people concentrated in big cities, that's when you become overpopulated, right? So if you look on the Earth's surface, we don't occupy very much of it. We occupy it in sections, right? So large cities in China have large populations. large cities in the United States have large populations, like New York, LA, Seattle, for instance. But when you leave those cities and go to other cities, you find there's nobody in between. All right, I think everyone's had enough, Deborah.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you.
Thank you much, Dwayne. I would most of all like to thank everyone that attended tonight. I think it's the first time, as I said, we're doing a lecture in St. Nicholas, and I look forward to many, many more. I would say let's meet downstairs. We have 2 typical Aruban snacks, and also supporting our local business, Culture Cafe. There is a cash bar so you can purchase your drinks, but feel free to stay, hang around, speak to Dwayne. He will be back next year, but I'm already planning with some key persons in the room a lecture looking at Mr. Gregory Richardson, Smile Gregory. I want to thank also our international students from the University of Aruba who are visiting with us. They just started this semester, and this is the first time they came to St. Nicholas, and they're already in love, so they will experience our food and culture in the coming weeks when we drag you guys out. So, sorry? And, sorry? And I would like to thanks again, We Culture, Sunny and Celeste, thank you very, very much. I hope that we can partner together and do for much more lectures. Culture Cafe, Nicholas again, thank you very much. And if I forgot someone, Sunny, just...
No, well, I just wanted to mention for those of you, which is, if it's your first time, there's a couple of unique drinks that Culture Cafe provides, so maybe you can, for your taste buds, you can try something different.
Which are typical to the Caribbean, isn't
it? Which are like sorrel, which is like hibiscus flower, or sage and lime, which is botanical name is what? Melissa, sage, and
there was something.
And the ginger beer.
Sorry. No, sorrow. You have this conversation. Sorrow comes from.
It comes from the native population here. Sorrow is indigenous to the Caribbean. So. It's Central and South America.
Okay.
Where do you think it comes from, Sonny?
Nothing, but the one that the supplier that I got the sorrel from is actually from Egypt, on the plains of the Nile. Yeah. I know Venice, South America, yes, definitely Venezuela has a lot of it. Every time the rain comes, it grows just like wild bush.
Yeah. Mexico also has a lot of sorrel too.
Okay, great.
So if I forgot anything?
No, We Culture is always the last Saturday of the month, so actually 2 Saturdays from now, the 24th, we'll be having a session downstairs, outside, so feel free if you're at the time and drop in. Same time, 7, and we'll be there. We'll have a panel discussion on gang relation to the community and its effects and so forth. All right, great. Thank you.
Thank you all very much for coming.
Let's finish.